I'm also chair of the governors of a Catholic secondary boys' school. And I thought that perhaps I ought to just check out what the religious education was like in the school, how it was going. So I stopped a year 7 lad, and for those of you over the age of 35, year 7 means first year in secondary school. And I said to him, what were you being taught in your RE lessons? And he said, well, we were being taught about how Moses had got one over on the Pharaoh of Egypt. And I said, oh yeah, what was that? Oh, well, he said, Moses was taking the Israelites out of Egypt back to the Promised Land. And they came to the Red Sea and they couldn't get across it. And this was a big problem because they could see Pharaoh's army coming, chasing them, was going to kill them. So Moses got his iPhone out and he got to get the Navy app on his iPhone. So he got the Navy and they came and they built pontoons and bridges across the Red Sea. And they all went across it. Oh yes, I said, oh. What happened next? Oh, he said, well, they could see the Egyptian army coming. They were beginning to get onto these bridges and pontoons. So he got out his iPhone again and get Air Force app. And the Air Force came and bombed this thing, smashed them all to pieces. And the Egyptians went, and Moses went on his way. Now, at this stage, I'd had enough of this. And I said, that's not what they really told you, is it? And he said, well, no, it isn't what they really told me. But if I told you what they really told me, you wouldn't believe me. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because when you go and talk to people about pro-life things, and when we go and talk to people about pro-life things, like that schools talk you heard yesterday evening from Haig, they can't believe it. They don't hear this. The people out there don't hear this thing from anybody else. Things that we heard today from Dr. Newton and Dr. Watt, and you'll be hearing over this weekend, they don't hear it. And you will have experienced it yourself to some extent. You say things to people which are just obvious, really, in your mind, but they just don't believe it. And this is going to be an experience. And they can't believe it. They daren't believe it. Because if they believe it, if they accept what you're saying, what they're admitting to. They're admitting to accepting 600 babies being killed every day in this country alone. And that's a horrible thing to have to admit. Now, as Anthony rather cruelly said yesterday, I was alive when the Abortion Act was passed in 1967. Oh, you've got my pictures of my family on that. That's my screensaver. I was alive in 1967. In fact, I was about your age then. The caption on this photograph is just a sort of generic lawyer's thing. It's called Fair If Not Beautiful. And I'll get rid of it now because I've got some other things that I want to talk to you about, which perhaps a bit more what we're talking about. I wanted to really present this talk in things that you think you know about abortion, but perhaps you don't. And yes, people really did wear clothes like that in the 1960s. I didn't put any men's clothes up, they're even more outlandish. But 1967, the 1960s, was a period, if you imagine, after the war, austerity. My parents, your grandparents, had a hard time during the war. The 1960s came along, and suddenly we thought we could do everything. Summer of Love wardrobe, it says at the bottom there. And suicide was decriminalised, homosexuality was decriminalised, divorce appeared. All these things, suddenly we thought we'd found the answer to everything. And fashions like that came along. And, believe it or not. And the first thing I was going to put to you is the idea that all abortion was illegal in the UK before 1967. No, it wasn't. And this now comes back to, we're going a bit into sort of law lecture session now, so have the fun and games. And I know there are some law students here, and the law students will tell you what absolute joy and pleasure it is to be in the law lecture. Constant joy and fun and so on. But I'll try and get through the hard parts of it fairly quickly, and we'll move on. But the law of abortion, the modern law of abortion, modern in inverted commas, starts in 1861. You've got on your sheet there, the Offence Against the Person Act, 1861. Now that act, in fact, brought together a whole lot of offences against the person. Murder, manslaughter. There's even a section dealing with interfering with the clergyman in the execution of his duty. But sections 58 and 59 dealt with abortion. And section 58 prohibited, said you must not do abortion, and section 59 said you mustn't supply the medicines and the instruments that allow abortions to be carried out. Section 58, every woman being who with intent to procure her own miscarriage shall unlawfully administer to herself any poison or other noxious thing, or shall unlawfully use any instrument or other means whatsoever with the like intent, and whosoever with intent to procure the miscarriage of any woman, whether she be or be not with child, shall unlawfully administer to her or cause to be taken by her any poison or other noxious thing, or shall unlawfully use any instrument or other means whatsoever for the like intent, shall be guilty of felony. Now, I've just read that through very quickly, and it's in rather sort of Victorian-type language, but I think you can get the general sense that any woman who carries out an abortion on herself, or anybody who helps her to do that, is going to be guilty of a felony. Just one or two things I want to point out particularly. First of all, the word unlawfully. It's slightly odd thing to put in there, because of course if it's against the act, it's unlawful. But I'll come back to that word in a minute. The first part of it talks about a woman administering to herself any poison she would be guilty of an offence. The second part is dealing with other people, the doctors who carry out an abortion. They're only guilty if the woman is pregnant. The woman is only guilty if she is pregnant. Other people are guilty if she is or if she isn't pregnant. So if the doctors say, oh yes dear, you are pregnant, give me £100 and I carry out an abortion, the fact that she's not pregnant is not going to let them off. And so this was a sort of very early protection for women, really, against being exploited in that way. So that was the law. I'm going through this fairly quickly. You're not going to be tested on it, so there'll be no exams, and you can look at it again afterwards. Or we could spend most of the morning just dealing with this, but I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. That was the law, 1861, and in fact it had been the law before that, even before that. This section is a section from an earlier act in 1837, and it went back 200, 300, 400 years. They knew that abortion was wrong. They didn't have ultrasound, they didn't have photographs in the womb and all that stuff that we've got these days. They knew it was wrong. It wasn't murder, but it was a killing. It was homicide. It was part of homicide. It was a form of homicide. And that was the law from 1861 onwards. And that act is still around today. That's why it's on this piece of paper. It's not historical. It's still around, and I'll come back to that a bit later as well. And then, so abortion was illegal in the UK before 1967, but it wasn't. The next thing that happened in the story was the Infant Life Preservation Act in 1929, because there was, lawyers love these fancy words, there was a lacuna in the law. That means a gap. And there was a gap, there was thought to be a gap. If a child was killed as birth was taking place, was that an abortion under this section 58? Or was that murder? And murder can only be carried out on a born person. If the child was killed during birth, and it was thought that maybe people were carrying out abortions by leaving it to the last minute, then killing the child, and then maybe escaping that way. So the Infant Life Preservation Act plugged that gap and introduced this new offence of child destruction. And in fact, it's worded in such a way that during the course of the trial, if it turns out, when the facts of the case come out, that it wasn't child destruction, but it was abortion because it happened a bit earlier, or it was murder, it happened a bit later, the prosecution could change tack onto murder or onto abortion. So it was to make sure there was a sort of seamless protection for the child. But there was a get-out, and you'll see at the end of subsection 1, no person shall be found guilty of an offence under this section unless it is proved that the act which caused the death of the mother was not done in good faith for the purpose only of preserving the life of the mother. Now, it's a sort of double negative. Why lawyers can't just say it straight out, but what it means is if the child was killed purely to save the mother's life, for no other reason, then the doctor would be excused, or whoever it was who carried out would be excused. Now that seems reasonable, but it was the first sort of push into the law of a get-out for abortion. Looking back on it now, you know, you might say, well, it's a reasonable thing to put in it, but it was the first sort of chink in the armour of the law. And I just asked you to note in subsection 2 the reference to the period of 28 weeks. Evidence that a woman had at any material time been pregnant for a period of 28 weeks shall be prima facie proof that she was at that time pregnant of a child capable of being born alive. Because what this section was dealing with was children that were capable of being born alive. In other words, towards the end of the pregnancy. They were protected. Now, the next significant thing that happened was that case at the bottom involving Dr. Bourne. Dr. Bourne was a Harley Street surgeon who worked either at, I think it was Guy's or St Thomas's Hospital in London. And he had a young girl patient, 15 years old, who had been raped and been made pregnant by 4 guardsmen. And she was perfectly healthy. He could have had the baby. But he thought that he ought to carry out an abortion. In 1938, when this took place, the 1861 Act was there, abortions were no, you just didn't do abortion. But he thought, I must do something for this girl. He went to the police station down the road and said, I'm going to carry out an abortion on this young woman. And they said, you mustn't do that. And he said, well, I'm going to. And he did. And he was prosecuted, and this was the case. And the judge, it's a criminal case, it's not a legal precedent. He was found not guilty, and there's no decision therefore, it's just accept that he was found not guilty. But the judge, in a criminal case, the judge says to the jury, this is what the law is, you've now heard the facts, you decide where it fits in, whether the person's guilty or not guilty. And what he said to these people in the case was, abortion, covered by the 1861 Act, talks about unlawfully administering to herself and so on and so forth. So he said, if it says unlawfully, it must have anticipated that it was possible to do it lawfully. So what is a lawful abortion? That's what he said. He then leapt forward to the 1929 Act and said what they must have been thinking about in 1861 was what was put into the Act in 1929, some kind of sort of legal telepathy that he got in his mind. Anyway, and he said in 1929 they decided that if a child was killed purely to save the mother's life, then that will be lawful. So he said, oh, that's what they must be thinking about. But of course he got another mountain to leap over, or a chasm, because in fact this woman's life wasn't in danger. She was a young woman. She was perfectly healthy. So he said, oh, well, life doesn't mean life. Life means life. Life. You know. And it was summed up, what he said to the jurors, if you decide that this abortion was carried out to save this young woman from becoming a physical or mental wreck, then it was a lawful abortion. And they decided that was, and therefore Dr. Bourne got off. And I mentioned, and before 1967, there were about 7,500, according to the RCOG's estimated, nobody really knows, legal abortions carried out by doctors using the protection of this Bourne case. They weren't prosecuted because they said, well, it was done to prevent my patient becoming a physical or mental wreck. So there were legal abortions carried out. Item number 2, abortion was legalised in the UK in 1967. Yes? No. it wasn't. If you turn over, you will see the Abortion Act is there, most of it is there, certainly Section 1, which is the main part. And if you look at Section 1, St. David Steele's name was mentioned earlier on by Dr. Newton. David Steele, who's still with us, was, at the time, 29 years old. He was the youngest MP in the House of Commons. He managed to get a place number 1 in the ballot. They have a ballot each year for a private member's bill, and he was encouraged to introduce it was called the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Bill, really to sort of hide it, and then when it became law, it was changed to the Abortion Act. And he brought this in, and he spent the last 45 years justifying what he's done, and Dr. Newton mentioned, he'd heard him a few years ago trying to justify what he'd done. Well, that's between him and his conscience, but I wouldn't like to be in his shoes. Anyway, he introduced this bill, and what you've got there, actually, it was amended in 1990 by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, and what you've got there is as amended in the square brackets, so the amendments that came in 1990, and I'll talk about those a bit later. And in subsection 1 there, it says, subject to the provisions of this section, a person shall not be guilty of an offence under the law relating to abortion when a pregnancy, I'll just stop there, shall not be guilty of an offence under the law relating to abortion. When you comply with this Act. What it doesn't say is the 1861 Act is finished. I mean, that's normally what happens with a new law. It says the previous law is abolished and we start now with a new one. We repeal the old Act. It didn't. So the 1861 Act is still in force, and if a doctor does not comply with the conditions that are set out here in the Abortion Act, then he is guilty of, or can be charged under 1861 Act. And the punishment for being guilty, in 1861 it was deportation to Australia. And I know there's at least one Australian in this room. Not everybody who went to Australia was a criminal, but quite a lot of them were. But they were only the serious criminals. I say only. They were the serious criminals. So abortion, even in 1861, was a serious act. And today, it's life imprisonment. So it's a serious crime. If you can't comply with the Abortion Act provisions, then it's a serious crime. It's not just like a parking offence. It's a serious crime. And yet, how many prosecutions have there been? Well, not entirely. But very, 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 very few. And when you think that there have been 7 or 8 million procedures, knowing human nature as we do, we can't believe that 7 or 8 million times it's been done perfectly in accordance with the Act. But the authorities just won't do anything about it. But what I'm trying to get to is that abortion wasn't legalised in 1967. And it's still illegal today, although the Abortion Act has undermined it considerably, so that it is almost impossible to get a prosecution. And you will have read recently in the papers the stories about these sex selection abortions, which aren't really covered here, debatable, but they are. And abortions where doctors, it says in here, they have to sign, 2 doctors have to sign a certificate in good faith that the abortion is justified according to the Act. And they've signed the certificates in advance. In fact, in one hospital, they found a drawer full of certificates, blank certificates, signed by a doctor who wasn't even working in the hospital anymore. And they just take one out, and another doctor signed, and there it is. So then the law isn't being complied with, but it is still there. So we need to be aware of that. And you need to be aware of it. So, let's click on that. Well, it's given you the answer to that, but you might have guessed what it would be. Abortion is illegal in Northern Ireland. No, it isn't. And if you look at section 7 right at the bottom of the page, I haven't put the wording in there, but it says the Act does not extend to Northern Ireland. So the Abortion Act does not apply in Northern Ireland. Now, the Abortion Act got rid of the Born decision. It said anything to do with abortion is as in this Act. And in Northern Ireland, the Unborn case still exists. So abortions are carried out legally in Northern Ireland based on the decision in Unborn's case. So if a doctor over there says that I'm doing this abortion to prevent a woman from becoming a physical or mental wreck, then it's allowed. And most of them, if not all of them in Northern Ireland, are done because the baby. I mean, they never know, absolutely, with all the tests, the doctors. And you'll see in the Abortion Act, it just talks about the risk of disability. Because they don't really know, and very often people will be told that your baby is going to have spina bifida or something, and it doesn't. But that's what most of the legal abortions in Northern Ireland are done. There are only very few, but there are some. Another thing I would put to you is in 1990, the time limit for abortions was reduced from 28 weeks to 24 weeks. There was a case in 1982 of it was called the Oxford student case, and SPUC was involved in this, and it involved a student at Oxford University, 2 students, and the girl became pregnant, and she decided she was going to have an abortion, and her boyfriend said, no, I don't want you to have an abortion. And in the end, he took her to court, and SPUC paid for the costs. The court case came up on Thursday. The man lost the case. There was an appeal on the Friday, the Court of Appeal. The judges said, we'll think about it over the weekend, we'll make a decision on Monday morning. On Monday morning, the Court of Appeal said, no, she can have the abortion. A further appeal was made to the House of Lords, now it's the Supreme Court, the House of Lords, for permission to appeal to the House of Lords, because you have to do that. And they said, no, that's it, she can have her abortion. And that was the end of the case. That was about 1982. Roll on about 20 odd years. Youth 2000 event, pilgrimage at Walsingham in Norfolk. And SPUC had a stall at that conference. And the SPUC volunteer who had been managing that stall on the Monday morning came into the office. Has anybody here heard about the Oxford student case? Remember, it was 20 years previously. And then, so this story was told. She said, oh, well, I was standing at the stall, and a young woman came up to me and said, is this a SPUC stall? She said, yes, it is. She said, well, you saved my life. It's too poignant, actually. She was the daughter of this couple, because just over that weekend, her mother said to the boyfriend, all right, I won't have an abortion. If you look after the baby, I won't have an abortion. And so, there she was. So they lost the case, but saved the baby. Now, that's what you can do. That's what you can do. You might not have to pay for the cost of a legal case. I hope you don't have to pay that amount of money. But just in what you say, somebody was talking about here, talking to your friends, just in what you say, you may not even know about it. But just in what you say might encourage and save that child, and not only that child, but the mother as well from the life of anguish. And not only that child, but all his or her descendants to the end of time. That's something to think about. And that's, I could say, a grace, a beauty that could come to you. I'm going to move on very quickly because what I wanted, perhaps I get a chance to talk about that at the weekend, but that's quite involved, and I'm not going to go through that now. Now, the last 2 things I want to mention to you are just a little bit of a, to do my own. Abortion kills babies, yes? Yes? You know what I'm going to say. No, it doesn't. Those are babies. That's not what gets killed in abortions. What gets killed in abortion are children. And again, if you look at the Abortion Act, it talks about child. So if you're arguing, discussing with people, you talk about a child, and your opponent says, oh, you're being too emotional. You say, well, it's in the Abortion Act. It talks about the child, a child. And if it's in the Abortion Act, which is what you're trying to defend to me, then it's good enough for me. Now, baby is a term which describes a period in your life. A teenager, adolescent, adult, geriatric, as some of us are. But child, we're all children. We're all our parents' children, whatever age. And that applies to the embryo, the tiny little dot. You can't say that's a baby. And we were talking yesterday about abortifacient contraceptives. They're killing embryos. They're not killing babies. So, although in normal life, when you're talking in your family, you talk about the baby, we're expecting a baby, and the baby's kicking mummy's tummy, and yeah, that's fine. But when you're getting down to serious argument, if you use the word child, you cannot be criticised. Abortion kills the unborn child, yes? No. This is an unborn child. It's a sort of diagrammatic, medical thing. It's a concept like the unknown warrior. It's, you know, where is the unborn child? Just show me the unborn child. It doesn't exist. It's just an idea. It's a metaphysical idea. What is killed in abortion is a child, children, and it makes it more personal. And so our society is called the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. And although I don't think that the people who created the society in 1967 really had thought that through properly, nevertheless they got it right and they got the name right. And I think it's important for you to bear that in mind yourselves in your discussions, because it demystifies a thing. And our opponents love to call us the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child, because the unborn child does not exist. But unborn children do, millions of them. So that's a tremendous gallop. As I said, we could spend the whole morning talking about the law. But that's just given you a few things to be thinking about and to take away from this weekend. Thanks very much.